Hello and welcome back to another episode of DigiPod on DawnNews English. I'm your host, Usama Khilji. Today, we're going to be talking about surveillance in South Asia. As governments across the region acquire increasingly sophisticated surveillance equipment and technology, are legal safeguards and democratic oversight keeping pace with this advancement in technology? Or is the region quietly becoming more surveilled and less accountable? Seeing as the region is all composed of democratic countries, it's important for there to be safeguards around surveillance that takes place. So, to discuss this and more, we're joined by Maria Nazar from the Digital Rights Foundation, who will be talking about DRF's new report on surveillance in South Asia. Thanks very much for joining us, Maria.
Thank you so much, Osama, for having me.
So, to start with, we'll talk a bit about what prompted this regional study on cyber surveillance in South Asia and why is it important right now? And
So, I believe, given the times that we're living in, we're seeing a lot of dystopian news come around, not only from South Asia, but across the world, where we're seeing people's privacy being used, being accessed, being exploited by governments as well as by private entities. And one thing about the South Asian region itself is not only that information regarding privacy and surveillance is unsaid in a lot of circles, but it's also unresearched. So we don't really know what's out there. We don't really know how we're being surveilled, if at all, how that information is being used, whether it's necessary or not. And so the report really came out of a need to understand before we move on to taking action against anything that might be inhibiting people's fundamental rights.
right, so that access to information is very important. And as we see in the region, transparency is a big challenge. And without transparency, there is very little chance of accountability. So, how did the research pan out? Were there challenges in accessing information or getting information around the different surveillance regimes that exist in the region?
So when we started planning for this research, what we had in mind was we were very conscious of the fact that we wanted the research to be produced out of experts based in the countries that we were researching. So we wanted country experts from Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan who could not only add to the context given their own mm, citizenship within these countries, but also who knew where the problems were, where the gaps were, who actually lived these realities in one way or another, or knew people who lived these realities. So it really started off by finding these experts within the region, identifying them, talking to them about what they wanted to look into, what issues they thought under the surveillance landscape were important, and then moving forward from that. Another aspect to this that we really wanted to focus on was we wanted to show not only the similarities within the region, but as well as how each country is unique in its own fight against cyber surveillance. So while our report has a very standardized structure, which is divided in three parts. So it goes from historical context to legal laws and regulations and ends with impacts on human rights. The format itself is same across the report, but as people who get to once they get to read the report, they'll notice is that there are certain differences which make you think that a region that's so similar in its history as well as in its laws can also differ in the way that it operates in the surveillance landscape.
So, getting a little bit into the findings of the report, Maria, maybe you could walk us through a bit on what justifications are governments in South Asia using for implementing these surveillance programs across the region.
So one of the common justifications that not only nations within South Asia, but also internationally that governments are using nowadays is, and this is true for all defense spending as well as all activities that the government does undertake, is the need for national security. Now, given South Asia's history with terrorism, with civil unrest, with geopolitical tensions, national security has always been a vague definition that has been used by countries across this region as well as in the Middle East to justify not only spending on cyber surveillance, but also on spending on defense spending that either limits fundamental rights or in some way or the other hinders people from fundamental rights such as right to privacy, freedom of expression. Uh, One thing that we've known, and this becomes more concerning and alarming in today's day and age, where you see geopolitical tensions increase in ways that we've never seen before. So you have tensions between countries on such an escalating pace and in such a vastly different way. You have tensions between Pakistan and India, you have tensions between Sri Lanka and India, you have tensions between Iran and the US, which, I mean, the US isn't in the region, but the fact that Iran is being impacted, and we do share a border with it, has an impact on our defense spending as well. So what we see is that national security, which in itself, to a certain extent, you understand that there might be a need, a very certain important need for surveillance when it comes to things like terrorism, when it comes to things like targeting people either across borders or within borders who might want to hinder a country. What you also see is that these warfare tactics are then used to monitor and infiltrate government controlled websites as well as private individuals who might want to give any kind of information on political dissent or might want to use their freedom of expression to share opinions about what countries are doing, what laws are doing within their region, and how they're impacting livelihoods on a daily basis.
Right. So as you're describing it, surveillance, there's within the countries also, but then there's also intra-region surveillance that's happening, posing as cybersecurity threats, which then are used as justification for further restrictions in the online space as well. Maybe now we can talk a bit about the law, the loopholes and the accountability gap that exists. So maybe you can tell us a bit about how Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka are regulating surveillance. So what are the legal regimes like?
I think before we dive into what the modern law as we know it at this point in time says about this region, what we need to understand is that South Asia the roots of the laws and regulations that bind us today find their roots in colonialism. And that is what then shapes a lot of the laws that come under monitoring, controlling citizens, which comes directly from the British when they were here and when they were using these laws to stifle dissent within the locals, within nationals, and then using these laws to stop them from either gaining independence or even just speaking out against injustices done by the British colonialism.
And we're still using the same penal codes.
And we're still using the same penal codes. We're still using the same language. Our laws are written in English. Nobody really understands. The layman might not understand fully what the law actually says because the layman doesn't know English the way an educated person within the country would know. So what we see is that the law at the moment is, firstly, at face value, you see that the region is starting to think about important regulations that will help citizens. So when you look at things like data protection laws and curbing harms caused by digital technologies, either in the face of TFGBV, technology facilitated gender-based violence, or also just AI-related harms, you see that these regions and these countries are actively trying to regulate and stop these technologies from being used in a bad way. But at the same time, the process isn't as nearly well thought out or as rigorous or as detailed as it should be, as compared to countries within the European Union, such as the UK, Ireland, Germany, who have really sophisticated and detailed data protection laws and privacy laws that help citizens exercise their rights. Within the region, you see that in Pakistan, for example, you have a data protection law that's in process, but it has been in process for about 4 years now, and we don't really see it going anywhere. So we're kind of behind in understanding, not only regulating this technology, but also understanding how it needs to be regulated, what harms it can cause, and in what ways does it need to be framed to make sure that all walks of life, not only just your layman citizens, but also your especially vulnerable professionals, such as journalists, lawyers, judges, human rights defenders, how can they be protected under laws like this? We also need to remember that underneath all of this, there is this behemoths called artificial intelligence, which we really don't understand where it's going, what it's doing to us right now. AI at the moment under surveillance technologies is a very big question mark, not only for the South Asian region, but also internationally. Governments don't really understand how AI will be impacting surveillance in the long run, why processes such as facial recognition or biometric databases are important. And before passing these things, like I mentioned, what you need at the base of all of this is a data protection law that ensures that while these processes are necessary, they're also being regulated to make sure that private information isn't being used in by governments to either track or surveil their own citizens.
That is so important. And we're also noticing that there is a gap between surveillance powers that governments have and independent oversight. So, in your research, have you come across any independent oversight of surveillance that is being carried out in any of the countries that were researched?
So that's a really interesting point you raised because we had a set of discussions with experts within the region where we wanted to talk about the findings of this report, and one thing that constantly came up was that while there are international oversight bodies such as the Pall Mall process, which are looking to regulate not only cyber surveillance but also spyware technologies, and looking to regulate companies and investors that invest in these technologies and make it possible for the procurement of these technologies on a wide scale. What we see is that regionally, there isn't a lot of oversight that's been happening either through international bodies such as this or locally through South Asian specific bodies. And I think the gap is formed from it's a two-part problem, which is formed not only from a lack of understanding and a lack of knowledge that this is what's happening in the region, this is how people are being targeted, this is how people are being surveilled, but also a lack of understanding on how can we all come together and target this procurement and deployment of cyber surveillance in a collective way, given everybody's own legal systems, their own governments and political party system that might, where you might need to make a few tweaks, but at the same time, the underlying problem stays the same. An interesting thing that we also noted within these conversations was that CSOs specifically across the region in India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan are having these conversations behind closed doors, where they do think that their partnership and they're not only talking about these issues, but also trying to raise awareness about these issues really does help people to firstly understand what the problem is and then move towards understanding how to solve it or how to hold governments accountable. But at the same time, there's only so much a group of 30 people within companies that are restricted in their own right. There's only so much that they can do. A lot of the problems that come up largely are that since there's no transparency within the region, since we don't really know what surveillance technology or spyware, we can speculate and we can make guesses about what's being used, how it's being deployed. But since we don't really know for sure on paper what surveillance technology is being used, what spyware may be used, what impact it has on the right to privacy and the right to freedom of speech, we can't really know how to move forward. So I think when you talk about independent oversight, what's important first is that you need to ask governments to be transparent in their mechanisms, to be transparent in what they're buying, what they're selling, why not only within the region, but also outside of the region, because as our report would also note, a lot of these technologies come from either the UAE, they come from the European Union, they come from China. So holding these not the countries themselves, but also their companies accountable and having them be transparent about what they're providing is going to be the first step to reaching a point where we can have independent oversight once we understand what the problem really is.
Right. And what you're describing is very important. And, in international human rights law, we have a whole mechanism on the UN Guiding Principles on Business Human Rights, which outlines states' responsibilities, but also, like you said, companies' responsibilities, right? And then the state's responsibility of ensuring that companies that work within their borders are not exporting technology that undermines human rights. But in the surveillance world, we do see this happening on a rampant scale. So I'm very glad that this report is also coming out and documenting these processes, which can then be used to make further arguments, especially in line with the UN guiding principles. You spoke about the rights holders, right? When citizens are being surveilled. But what you also described was that citizens have very little visibility into how their data is collected, how it is being stored, and how it's being used or processed. So, what does that process look like? And where does this report see citizens in the midst of all of this, since citizens are the primary rights holders that are impacted the most? So, what happens when citizens have very little visibility on how their data is being, used in so many different ways?
So I think, firstly, it's important to understand that the South Asian region, for all purposes, is a democratic region, largely. Sri Lanka is a democracy, Pakistan is a democracy, India is a democracy, Bangladesh is a democracy. And one of the foundations of democracy is that the citizens have the right to speak up when they think something is wrong, when they want to hold their government accountable for something, when they think something needs attention by the government, and they have the right to ask questions and they deserve answers for those questions. So when you keep that in mind, what's important to understand is that when you're using surveillance technologies within the region, either from cross-border, either if it's cross-border surveillance or even within border surveillance, what the citizen is important in the sense that he or she has the right to say that they deserve to know how their information is being used, why they might be under suspicion, if they are under suspicion, either by cross-border parties or by countries that might be interested in their information. And then they deserve to have the right to ask these questions. So what we're seeing within this region increasingly is that surveillance is used not only to track people from a distance, but also then to use that information to then hold them under some kind of legal law that they're in violation. For example, we see this in India a lot, where people are being, as well as in Bangladesh, where people are being tracked for the information that they post online, the information that they give, whatever conversations are happening on the internet, either as an opinion-based conversation or as a conversation about what the government should be doing. They track these individuals and then they hold these individuals accountable under laws that are really vague and that just are made just to serve the purpose of stifling any kind of political dissent. And when under citizens themselves try to exercise these rights and then are taken to court or are taken to jail because of them, what we largely see happening is that there's this vast amount of censorship that stops people from speaking up about what they want to say. You start having conversations in closed doors, in living rooms, in circles that they feel comfortable in, instead of having these conversations on a large scale where the the point is not only to keep talking about these issues, but also to raise awareness about these issues and to let people know that this is what's happening within their region or within their country, and this, for all events and purposes, is not right or should not be done like this.
Right. And what you're describing is the extreme chilling effect, right, that surveillance has on speech and on fundamental freedoms. And then also the self censorship that comes with that. So, Maria, maybe we can talk a bit about the technologies that are being used and they're reshaping surveillance today. We've seen a whole new supply of different sophisticated technologies for surveillance, including telecom interception, internet monitoring, biometric databases, facial recognition technologies, and of course, artificial intelligence powered surveillance. So, what is the most common form of technology that's being deployed by governments in South Asia that we know of? Or, are they similar across the region by different governments that the research looked at? Are they different? Maybe you can shed a bit of light on those.
So I think what is important to establish before we dive into this is that within international conversations, there's a bit of discussion about what really can be termed as cyber surveillance. And there's this very clear line that's drawn between cyber surveillance and spyware, where spyware is a lot more sophisticated and a lot more covert. And cyber surveillance is makes itself known very easily to the people that they're surveilling, as well as to people who might be tracking the surveillance. So within South Asia, and this is something that our report
So,
starts off
sorry, so
with,
spyware is more targeted, but cyber surveillance is on a mass scale?
cyber spyware is more covert. There's no active way of knowing when somebody is using some kind of software to target you. Cyber surveillance, on the other hand, is a lot more open in the sense that you know that this information is being monitored or that this information is being tracked. So, for example, uh, if you look at information that's gathered by telecom companies, that is information that telecom companies within the
Hmm.
region, within South Asia, as well as within Southeast Asia, that these people are taking this information from you. How this information is being used, we don't really know, but the fact that it is being tracked in itself says that it's cyber surveillance. Spyware, on the other hand, is when you look at things like Pegasus or softwares like Pegasus and Predator, where they make themselves known only once the device that's being targeted is sent off for some kind of forensic analysis. And once some kind of actual technical expert looks at it and understands that this bug exists within your device, whether that's a laptop or a cell phone, and then this bug is then being used to remotely track your information and your private information within that device. And what we see in South Asia is that there's a mix of both, but there's a large prevalence of cyber surveillance, mostly because of the ease of doing it. One thing that a lot of our researchers from Pakistan as well as Sri Lanka have noticed is that spyware in itself is a lot harder to procure. It's also a lot harder to deploy on a mass scale. It's easier when you know exactly who you have to target. Cyber surveillance is more easier when you have a group of people that you might want to target, and then you might choose the suspicious ones based on the information that you find. So, and then when you look at the technologies within South Asia, you have clear cases of spyware in countries like India, where you see a lot of Pegasus cases still under court and still under process in the Indian judicial system, where a lot of lawyers, layman citizens, and journalists are being targeted by spyware such as Pegasus, which was only found out because of notifications that were sent to their devices by companies such as WhatsApp and Google, letting them know that their device was compromised under threat. And in comparison to that, you have places like Pakistan and Bangladesh, where you have things like IMSI trackers, which are basically fancy ways of saying that telecom companies are looking at information that you're sending via SMS, pictures that you're sending, call logs, and using this information to then make a repository of everything that you've done over a period of time. At the same time, you also have digital monitoring systems which are deployed within the region on a large scale, where governments are looking to monitor and track the kind of information that's being said, the kind of information that's being shared, the kind of information that's being saved within the internet, and then using this to, at one hand, it's very rightly used to target people that might be using the internet and online spaces for harm, such as to track TFGBV, to track AI harms, to track deepfakes, to track fake news and disinformation. But at the same time, it's also very easily used to stifle political dissent, as we specifically have seen in Bangladesh over the course of a year when they just had their revolution. One concern that comes up when we're looking at these cyber surveillance technologies, as you also rightly mentioned, with the increase of artificial intelligence, AI-powered systems such as facial recognition, digital ID processing systems, and even algorithmic systems, means that governments and individuals are amassing large amounts of information about individuals, and we have no idea where it's going, how it's being used. In Sri Lanka, for example, governments are using India's Aadhaar system within their own country, and there's no information about how digital sovereignty plays into the equation when it comes to using a foreign state software for local ID processing systems. This data, and with this data collection, another issue that comes up is that this data can be very easily used to make highly accurate behavioral profiles of people across cities, across borders, across regions. And then this entail can then be used to make tailored messages for people, either for political gain or for private gain. It can be used to make completely adaptive disinformation campaigns, propaganda messaging, and based off of specifically what makes these people susceptible in today's climate. So while you have while there is a list of companies that you can list have been at one point operating within the region, there's also a big question mark about where these technologies are going to go in another 2 to 3 years. Not only are these technologies changing on a very fast pace, but it's also very hard to keep track of what companies are selling these technologies to governments within South Asia. So one thing that we've noticed specifically in the case of Bangladesh is that there are a lot of intermediaries being used. And so if you have one company, say for example, company X, and they might previously have been selling to Bangladesh or Pakistan or India through Greece, they might have now changed the name of their company and now very easily be selling that same product or that same software through Cyprus or through the UAE or through Israel, whatever is easier. So not only is it harder to keep track of what the government is using and deploying because of the lack of transparency within the region's tenders and defense spending, but it's also becoming hard to track it on an international scale because you don't really know how fast these companies change their names, how fast they change their processes and their softwares. And this just makes infiltrations of countries, of groups, of minorities a lot more easier than it was previously.
There's an entire surveillance industrial complex in play. And of course, it comes with issues of transparency, right? Um, maybe now we can move on to how South Asia's surveillance states rank. So I'm sure this study looked at, you know, who's doing the best, who's doing the worst in terms of surveillance. So which countries are more open and which are more closed when it comes to surveillance in South Asia?
I mean, it's a very sadist way to look at it, that you're ranking countries based on who's doing it best, who's doing the best job at surveilling, and who's doing the bad job, the worst job at surveilling these people. So what we looked at when we were making this ranking was that we've seen that it's a mix of three things that add to a region's surveillance arsenal and landscape. You have your transparency, you have your laws at the first level, then you have the transparencies of these laws and of the kind of technology that's being used, and then you have the impact that these technologies and that these laws have on human rights as a whole. What we see, and this it's detailed a lot, it's a lot more in our report, but what we see is that the severity of surveillance related harm is very closely tied to two structural factors, which are the degree of transparency in procurement and oversight and the strength or fragility of legal protections. So on one hand, you see that the lack of information on what the government is buying and where it's deploying these softwares or these surveillance technologies adds to this vacuum of information where you don't really know what you should be talking about or what you should be holding the government accountable for. And at the same time, you have fragile legal systems and really vague legal protections that make it impossible for people who have been targeted wrongly by these technologies to get any kind of remedy or recourse from their judicial systems. And while nation states themselves hold a very large chunk of responsibility for consequences from dealing from these violations of surveillance technologies, it's very important to understand, as I mentioned previously as well, that foreign third-party actors are taking a lot of advantage of the region, given
Mm,
that how politically unstable and vulnerable it is to these technologies. So, for example, you see a lot of companies within Israel, within Germany, within other regions in the West who are outside of proper reporting mechanisms use the fragile political state within Pakistan, India, Bangladesh to sell their products not only for private gain, but also just because the more you buy, the more popular you are, which makes you a better tool to use for everybody. So it's a collective problem that's not only limited to South Asia, but the whole world as we move towards a more integrated and connected and digitally powered lives, which where people are where it's hard to understand what is public and what is private. There's this blurring of lines between what information do you get to keep to yourself and what information do you have to give away in order to be considered a citizen or in order to be considered a national of a country.
and I believe, to what you're saying, even in the European Union's Artificial Intelligence Act that seeks to protect rights, the defense use of artificial intelligence is exempt from that act. So what we're looking at is that if European companies are exporting surveillance technology, for example, or spyware for defense purposes to other countries, that could potentially also get immunity under the EU's AI Act, and that's really a concerning aspect of this whole ecosystem, where tracking this becomes more and more difficult. So moving on, do we see under this research that South Asia is moving towards stronger safeguards, or are we just moving towards deeper surveillance?
So I think it's it's hard to give a definitive answer. I The short answer is we don't know. The
Hmm.
report itself answers a lot of questions, but it also raises a lot of questions. Where, when like I mentioned at the beginning, you see that governments at face value are starting to think about very important issues such as right to privacy and data protection and curbing harms that might be caused to citizens because of digital technologies, including surveillance technologies. But at the same time, you see that as we're living in a time where political unrest is so common and there is so much to be gained from violence and from dismantling a lot of political systems across the region. You also see that governments have a lot to gain from using these technologies on a vast scale, not only having targeted surveillance against people that might actually be a threat to nation states, but also targeting people across the border because you don't really know what threat there is. You don't know where the threat might come from. You don't know how to define it. And so it's easier to surveil everybody and then go from there. So I think the easy answer would be to say that we're definitely moving somewhere. But what's more important is to understand that citizens need to be educated about what's happening, about how their information can be used, about why their information is important. A lot of times, what we've noticed within our work at DRF, but also within the region, is that citizens don't really understand why their personal information is important or why it's important to ask these questions about why governments are asking you for where you were yesterday or what your location is or why they're tracking what kind of calls you're making, who you're making them to. So I think it's definitely a process, and we're definitely somewhere at the beginning of this process, which is a good thing. But at the same time, I feel like we're progressing a lot slower than how fastly technology is changing in front of us.
Absolutely. I think you summed it up really well. Thank you very much for joining us, Maria, and for shedding light on surveillance in South Asia. But like you rightly pointed out, there are a lot more questions at this stage than there are answers. And, this discussion has raised several other questions, right? Is the real issue surveillance itself, or is it the lack of accountability and transparency around surveillance? And can democratic societies really balance security and privacy in an era of artificial intelligence and mass data collection? And what we're seeing now is that with the expansion of technology companies, AI companies, there's increasingly a high amount of data that companies are holding that governments potentially have access to as well. So at the end of the day, where does that leave citizens? That's also a very, very big question that emerges. And hence, what should citizens, lawmakers, technology companies, and civil society groups be demanding next? That's also something to ponder over. So that's it from us today, and we'll be back with another episode of DigiPod on DawnNews English next Wednesday. This is your host, Usama Khilji, signing out. Thank you.